All right, we talked about President Lincoln being taken over to the Peterson house after he was shot by John Wilkes Booth in Ford's Theater. We also mentioned the two other assassination attempts and the result of those. So we'll start today with the death of a president. Now back at the Peterson house, President Lincoln is simply slowly dying. He is mortally wounded, he has no chance to recover, and he is simply slowly dying. And at the president's side is his wife and their oldest son, Robert. Okay? They actually had three sons. One died at the age of 11 while President Lincoln was in the White House. And the older son, Robert, was at the president's side. The younger son, Tad, they kept at the White House because they didn't believe he was old enough to understand or be emotionally well enough, so to speak, to be there when sooner or later his father was going to die. So at the president's side is his wife Mary and their older son Robert, and younger son Tad was kept at the White House. They believed he was too young to see his father in such a condition. Well, during the night, more than 100 people visited President Lincoln, which included Vice President Johnson, who, by the way, had no idea there was an assassination attempt upon his life that night, because the guy chickened out, remember, went out and got drunked up. But he visited President Lincoln, along with a large number of his cabinet. So more than 100 people visited President Lincoln during the night, including Vice President Johnson and many members of his cabinet. The next morning, on April 15th of 1865, at 7 a.m., President Lincoln's breathing slowed down considerably. So by 7 a.m., the morning of April 15th, 1865, President Lincoln's breathing had slowed, and 22 minutes later, at 7:22 a.m., the 16th President of the United States died at the age of 56. And at 7:22 a.m. that morning, the 16th President of the United States died at the age of 56. Shortly after Lincoln was pronounced dead, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stated, quote, "Now he belongs to the ages." So shortly after President Lincoln was pronounced dead, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stated, quote, "Now he belongs to the ages." Okay, that will now take us to the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. President has been shot, President has died. Secretary of State Seward has survived an assassination attempt by Lewis Payne. Vice President Johnson has survived an assassination attempt mainly because the person sent to assassinate him chickened out. And now we have a manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. Was very little doubt who shot the president, right? I mean, there was no question. The idea was to catch him. Now, after he shot President Lincoln and departed with his broken ankle out the back of Ford's Theater, John Wilkes Booth crosses the Potomac River, leaving Washington, D.C. And he goes south, a few miles south of the Capitol, and ends up in the state of Maryland, and David Harold is with him. So shortly after shooting President Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth, with his broken ankle, goes out the back door of Ford's Theater, mounts his horse, rides into the night. He and David Harold cross the Potomac River. They leave Washington, D.C. They go south of the Capitol and end up in the state of Maryland. David Harold, H-E-R-O-L-D, one of the co-conspirators. Now, the two men headed through Maryland, and they went to the tavern. Remember? The tavern that was being leased by Mary Surratt, where they had had meetings to plan both the kidnapping and killing of the president. They go through Maryland and head into Virginia and end up at that tavern that was leased by Mary Surratt. And he and Harold sit at the bar and have a few drinks, I don't know how many, and they depart. And as Booth departs the tavern, he tells the bartender that he killed Abraham Lincoln. Wasn't any doubt, really. The bartender, I don't know what his reaction to that would be. Probably didn't even know the president had been killed. So Harold and Booth travel into Virginia. They go to the tavern. It was leased by Mary Surratt. That same tavern where group had met in the past to discuss the kidnapping and then finally killing of the president. And upon leaving the tavern, Booth tells the bartender that he had killed Abraham Lincoln. Well, back in Washington, D.C., Secretary of War Stanton orders the manhunt of Booth and offers a $100,000 reward for his capture. So back in Washington, Secretary of War Stanton ordered the manhunt of Booth and offers a $100,000 reward for his capture. Nick, how much do you think that would be in today's money? $100,000. Okay, good guess. Anybody got a different guess? 1 million. How about $1,470,588.24? Just put 1.4 million and you'll be close enough. Be about like offering a $1.4 million reward. Now that's not only going to catch the attention of law enforcement, but who else? Anybody. Have you ever watched the movie SWAT?
Yes.
Remember that guy that captured that drug pin and he said, I'll give $100 million to anyone who gets me out of here? My God, every crooked outfit in the place was looking for him for that kind of money. So this not only, with this reward was offered, it didn't only have soldiers and law enforcement officers looking for Booth, who technically couldn't get paid for capturing him, right, because that's their job, right? But angry mobs also combed the countryside as well, thinking I could use $100,000. Well, the night of April 14th, after traveling to Maryland and then stopping at the tavern in Virginia, excuse me, Booth and Harold arrive at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, unfortunately for him. Because what does Mudd do? No, you should have. He treats his broken ankle, he splints up his broken ankle, and as soon as he's done, Booth and Harold leave the Mudd residence. But this does what? Implicates him in this whole thing. And we'll talk about that later. So late that evening of April 14th, Booth and Harold arrive at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Dr. Mudd places a splint on Booth's leg, and the two men left the Mudd residence. For the next 6 days, Booth and Harold camped out in a wooded swamp area in Maryland. For the next 6 days, John Wilkes Booth and David Harold simply camped out in a wooded area in Maryland, swamp area. Get out for 6 days. Three days later, the two men crossed into Virginia. 3 days later, the men crossed back into Virginia, and on April 24th, Booth and Harold arrive at the tobacco farm of Richard Garrett. So after hiding out for 6 days in a wooded swamp area in Maryland, the two men head to Virginia, and on April 24th, both Booth and Harold arrive at the tobacco farm of Richard Garrett. Now Garrett is a Southern sympathizer who allows Booth and Harold to do what? Stay in his
Farm.
but what barn? Stay in the barn. Very good. So again, on April 24th, Booth and Harold arrive at the tobacco farm of Richard Garrett, who's a Southern sympathizer, and he lets them stay in his barn. Well, early the next morning on April 25th, Booth and Harold are cornered in that barn by the 16th New York Cavalry. The next morning on April 25th, Booth and Harold are cornered in that barn by the 16th New York Cavalry. Well, as soon as the cavalry arrived, David Harold immediately surrendered. Put his hands up and surrendered. Booth refused. So as soon as the cavalry got there, David Harold surrendered, but Booth refused. So what did they do?
Shot him?
Not yet. Didn't want to shoot him because they wanted him alive. Matter of fact, Secretary of War Stanton ordered all military units and police departments to bring the man in alive. They wanted to know what his motive was, just like Lee Harvey Oswald. When he shot President Kennedy, when Jack Ruby shot him and killed him, the whole truth went away. They wanted this guy alive. But what'd they do to try to get Booth out?
Burn the barn.
Set the barn on fire. Very good. Set the barn on fire. And like I mentioned, the troops had orders from Secretary of War to take Booth alive. They wanted to talk to him. So they set the barn on fire, hoping to drive him out. Well, unfortunately, a sergeant in the New York Cavalry by the name of Boston Corbett silenced John Wilkes Booth for life. Unfortunately, a sergeant in the New York Cavalry by the name of Boston Corbett silenced John Wilkes Booth for life. What did he do, Aurora?
Kill him?
How? You said it before. He fired shots into the barn, and one of the shots found its mark. Corbett fired shots into the barn while it was on fire, and one of the shots found its mark. John Wilkes Booth was actually shot through the neck. It severed his vertebrae and left him paralyzed from the neck down. Even if the man lives, he's not living. You know what I mean? So the bullet pierces John Wilkes Booth through the neck. It severs his vertebrae and left him paralyzed. So the soldiers dragged him from the barn and laid him on the porch of Garrett's home. Couldn't walk, obviously. So the soldiers dragged him from the barn, laid him down on the porch of Garrett's home, and that's where Booth died at the age of 26. And that's where Booth died at the age of 26. What might be a question you may have? Well, let's not feel. Let's not get to him. What's it? Don't you have a question in your mind after I tell you that story? What? Well, no. But what's your question? Don't you have a question? Huh? Well, we're going to get to that. But as we tell you this story, what seems odd about this story? What? What? Yeah. Why did Corbett shoot? He was told not to shoot, was he not? So why in the world did Corbett decide that he wanted to shoot into the barn? Well, I'll tell you. He obviously was asked why he shot and killed Booth despite the orders from Secretary of War Stanton to bring him in alive, and his response was, quote, "God wanted me to do it." God wanted me to do it. Now, what does that tell you? What does that tell you? He's full of crap? It tells me that he must be either full of crap or he's a religious fanatic. Right? And that's what he was. What's a religious fanatic? Is that someone that's very religious? No, it's someone that's really out there religious. In other words, they don't really think straight. Now, this is a little bit gross, but I think you need to know the story to know about why this guy would shoot this guy when he was told not to. Because he screwed up history. Did you ever get to talk to John Wilkes Booth about what his situation was? No. Well, he was such a religious fanatic that he really punished himself one time for having immoral thoughts. He actually took company with a prostitute one night. And he felt so guilty about that because he's religious he, with lack of a better term, castrated himself. So the temptation would never come again. True story. That's what he did. That's how crazy this guy was.
So you have to write that down.
Well, it's up to you. I mean, it's history, and I don't care if you write it down or not. It probably won't be on the test. But the point is, you need to know about these people. You're going to hear some idiosyncrasies about Lee Harvey Oswald, not quite to that extent. But these people that do weird, off-the-wall things like Booth, even Corbett, who was told specifically, do not shoot this man, and he shoots anyway, right? Well, he said, God told me to do it. He was that much of a religious fanatic that after he felt like he betrayed God with his actions with the prostitute, that's the actions he took to punish himself, to never do it again. That's the kind of guy he was. Well, with that said, and it's true, sometimes you have to come out with the truth, what happened next? What had happened next in this whole thing? What do you think the government did now? You're darn right, they rounded up all of those co-conspirators and they arrested them. Rounded up and arrested them.
How did they know who it was?
Well, they did a little research.
Wait, so was
That's
Harold
their job.
also part of the reward? Like the 1.4 million, or was it just for Booth?
Booth. Because he was obviously the one who shot him, right?
Mm-hmm.
They aren't even aware of some of these conspirators, right? Who's the only one they might know something about? Right off the bat.
David Harold.
Who? Powell, because he, I mean, obviously he slashed up Secretary of State Surratt. So the rest of these guys, that's why you have investigations. People say, how'd they ever find out? Well, that's what they do for a living. That's what the soldier, the government does, the military, and that's what the police department does. So over time, they round up these co-conspirators, they arrest them, they try them, and they find them all guilty. And this will explain to you, April, May, June, July, August. This takes about 4 months to round these guys up and gal, arrest them, try them, convict them, sentence them. Okay? So, on July 7th of 1865, a little less than 4 months after the assassination, George Surratt, David Harold, Lewis Powell, and Mary Surratt. George Surratt, David Harold, Lewis Powell, and Mary Surratt were hanged in a public display to make examples of them. On July 7th, 1865, George Surratt, Mary Surratt, David Harold, and Lewis Powell were hanged in a public display to make examples of them. Mary Surratt became the first woman in the history of the United States ever to be hanged by the neck until dead. Mary Surratt. Okay. You think she should have got hung?
Yes.
Depends on who she knew about it.
Oh, I'm sure she did. I'm sure she met there. Yeah. But what are they doing? You're darn right they are. Okay? You're darn right. Now, off the topic a hair before we continue. If you want to watch a really good movie, it's called The Conspirator. And the whole thing's about the arrest, the trial, and the hanging of Mary Surratt. It's a really good show. And nobody wanted to defend this lady. Would you want to be the defense attorney? So this young upstart decides to take the job, and it's really a good story, and he tried his absolute best to get this woman from being hanged. He didn't try to get her off, he just didn't want to see her be hung. You get some time, you're bored, thank God we don't have anything to do tonight? Netflix up The Conspirator and watch that, pretty good. Now, let's move on, because this is interesting. When you hang somebody, what causes the death, Elisa? Not that you're the hangman, but what do you think would cause the death when you hang somebody? Well, even before that, what is it?
The neck breaks.
Yeah, well, so, you know, they drop them, 6-8 feet, and it snaps her neck and it kills him. Lewis Powell's neck was so thick that his neck did not snap, and he sat there for 8 minutes and eventually strangled him. That'd be a sad death. Elisa's way of saying that would be probably what most people think, but that would be kind of cruel, wouldn't it, to just have somebody hang there until they ran out of breath? The idea is to snap their neck, so it kills them instantly, there's no pain. Lewis Powell, he probably deserved everything he had coming. His neck was so thick that when they dropped him through, it did not snap his neck, and he simply hung there for 8 minutes and strangled him. That'd have been a horrible death, I'm sure. Well, what happened to the other conspirators? How about Samuel Mudd? How about Samuel Arnold, who we haven't talked too much about? How about Michael O'Loughlin, who we really didn't, did they do anything other than just be part of the talks? Other than Mudd treated the accused, right? Anybody want to guess what happened to those three fellas? Samuel Mudd, Samuel Arnold, and Michael O'Loughlin? You want to guess what they did to them? Somebody wants to guess? What? Granted them, that's, no, we probably wish that, but they put him in prison for life. Gave him life in prison. God dang, that's a little harsh, isn't it, for Samuel Mudd? If you think about it? Seems to be, I don't know.
Samuel Mudd, and who were the other two?
Samuel Mudd, Samuel Arnold, and Michael O'Loughlin, who we really never mentioned because their conspiracy part of that was what? Being there and helping plan, okay? Who we missing?
Harold. Oh, there.
How about John Surratt Jr.? Okay, he actually escaped to Canada and later fled to Europe to avoid arrest for the time being. So John Surratt Jr. fled to Canada and eventually ended up in Europe. Well, in 1867, they captured him abroad, which means they captured him in Europe, and they brought him back to the United States and put him on trial. So in 1867, John Surratt Jr., who was Mary Surratt's son, by the way, was caught abroad. They brought him back for trial, and the trial resulted in a